The priest spoke Latin during my confession, and I realized he wasn't actually forgiving my sins. I knelt in the confessional booth at St. Augustine's Cathedral on a rainy Wednesday evening, my knees pressing into the worn leather cushion that smelled faintly of incense and old wood. The latticed screen between me and Father Dominic cast shadows across my hands as I clasped them together, trying to find the right words to begin. I'd been coming to this church since I was 7 years old, sitting through countless masses with my grandmother who insisted that faith was the only thing that mattered in this world. She'd passed away 6 months ago, leaving me her entire estate with one strange condition in her will that I visit this specific church every month and make confession to Father Dominic personally. The lawyer had emphasized this wasn't just a suggestion, but a legal requirement to maintain the inheritance, which seemed odd, but I'd attributed it to my grandmother's intense religiosity. Father Dominic cleared his throat on the other side of the screen, and I could see his silhouette shift slightly as he settled into position. He was an older man, maybe in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd heard every possible sin a human could commit. I'd never actually spoken to him before tonight, despite attending this church for over 20 years, as he typically handled the evening confessions while I'd always attended morning masses. My voice came out quieter than I intended when I finally spoke, beginning with the traditional opening that my grandmother had drilled into me as a child. I told him it had been 6 months since my last confession, which was technically true, and began listing the usual minor transgressions that most people confess to when they didn't want to reveal anything truly personal. I mentioned being impatient with a coworker, judging someone harshly, lying about being sick to skip a social event I didn't want to attend. Standard stuff that wouldn't raise any eyebrows or require lengthy penance. Father Dominic listened in silence, and I could hear the faint sound of his breathing through the screen. When I finished my list and fell silent, waiting for him to begin the absolution prayer, something unexpected happened. He started speaking in Latin, which wasn't unusual for Catholic rituals, but the cadence was wrong somehow. I'd studied Latin extensively in college as part of my linguistics degree, spending 4 years translating ancient texts and religious documents. It was a skill I rarely mentioned because most people found it either pretentious or irrelevant to modern life, but it meant I could understand every word Father Dominic was saying, and what he was saying made my blood run cold. Instead of the traditional absolution prayer that begins with Deus Pater Misericordiarum, he was reciting something else entirely. The words were Latin, but they weren't prayers of forgiveness. He was speaking about recording and documentation, about adding my confession to some kind of archive, about how I'd fulfilled the first requirement, but there were more to come. His tone was businesslike, almost bureaucratic, as he continued in Latin that he clearly believed I couldn't understand. He mentioned my grandmother by name, calling her the benefactor, and said something about the terms of her agreement being binding across generations. Then he said something that made my stomach drop completely, that my confession today had been captured on the hidden recording device in this booth and would be stored with the others for future use if necessary. I stayed completely still, my hands frozen in their clasped position, trying to process what I was hearing while keeping my face neutral. Father Dominic continued speaking in Latin, describing how the inheritance I'd received was contingent not just on monthly confessions but on something he called the collection of vulnerabilities. He said the recordings would be kept in the cathedral's vault, along with confessions from dozens of other families who'd made similar arrangements over the decades. My mind was racing through implications while Father Dominic's Latin monologue continued, explaining that the church used these recordings as insurance against certain families ever speaking about church business or withdrawing their financial support. It was blackmail, plain and simple, disguised as religious practice and protected by the sanctity of confession. And that's when things took a turn I never expected. The rest of the story is linked below or on my channel.